Yeah, my name is Cornelia Staritz and I'm working for the Austrian Foundation for Development Research. And we're having a small group of people working on questions of international development, specifically from an economic perspective, but also on the question of development policy. So we do research on issues of international trade, international financial markets, and also specifically the role of developing countries and in these international financial and global contexts, and how EU policies, international policies also affect the policy space of developing countries. And we also have a big library in Austria on development issues.
Okay. Why do you feel global value chains are important for that work?
I'm a macroeconomist, so I came from a macro perspective, but after some time I realized to really understand issues of international development, you also have to understand how firms work, and firm strategies. So I think it's a very useful concept to combine like micro, meso and macro levels. Micro, I mean really understanding firms and how firms interact, but also on the meso level understand specific sector and industry dynamics, and macro also seeing the importance of institutional context on the local, regional and international level, and to some like a multi-scalar framework that can go through these micro, meso and macro levels. I think that's crucial. A second point that it's really center stage is the question of power, governance and lead firms, and that trade just doesn't only take place, but it's really governed by different actors, and there are important power imbalances. And maybe another important point is that the focus on upgrading and dynamic perspective, that it's not a like static competitive or comparative advantage, but that the question is not if but how can countries integrate into trade, and this can be also changed. I mean, it has to be changed to be sure that countries also gain from this integration. And then also come, I think, to a last important point, that the next to policy. So it's a useful tool to really link also analysis with policies, and also my institute I'm working, we very much focus on policy-oriented analysis, so trying to understand dynamics, but also say what does this mean for policy, for countries, for the European Union, and also for international regulatory contexts.
Yeah, are there any research projects that you've been involved with that have just been important or have implications for the field that you'd like to discuss?
I mean, on the one side, I've worked generally on global value chains and how this is used in the context of private sector development, and how it's also used by many international organizations. And there I think it's important to also focus on the critical theoretical points of global value chain and analysis. And then I specifically work on manufacturing sectors like textile and clothing that are very important in the development strategy of specifically low-income countries, trying to understand what is still the room to use the sector as a starting point in industrialization. And another research project we are working on currently is the question of commodity-based development. So with these commodity prices and all the financialization of commodity markets, what are the possibilities for many low-income countries that are still dependent on commodities to use commodities not only for unprocessed exports, but to somehow build broader linkages and start industrialization processes. So these are like the projects we work on.
Okay. The summit itself is now on its third day. What have you taken from the first two, and what are you looking forward to this final day?
Yeah, I mean, first it's just great to have the time that people from so different perspectives can come together. I mean, the academic crowd is also different, but we have met for quite regularly, so there are the debates we know, but also to bring international institutions and see what their perspectives are. I think this has been very, very useful. And I've also seen the variety of ways the global value chain approach is used as a basis, but then developed in further directions. But there I also see a bit a danger that yes, to not lose the more critical analytical aspects of the value chain approach. Specifically the points I pointed out before, the question of power, asymmetries, of governance, of institutional context, of policy. So I think it's important that these important aspects are included in the analysis.
Do you feel that's being lost or overlooked?
In some aspects, I mean, we saw here the great variety and the interesting discussions we have here, But I think if you just use value chains to just map more descriptively how trade takes place in the context of input-output analysis, that's not enough. That's an important start, and all this work which is going on with measurement I think is great and really important. But I think it's also important to link this with the key questions of governance, power, what it means for policy, the role of lead firms, the important role of the dynamic upgrading concept. So I think it's important to combine this, and for this I think such events are very useful, so that you can somehow interact and also see our differences. So that's important.
And this will be related to what you've discussed heretofore, but as you look forward to the next 3 or 5 years, what are the challenges for the field of global economic development, and how will there be continued relevancy for the GBC framework?
I think totally. I mean, there will be the relevancy, but I think this links to what I said before. I mean, it's important the important question is how global value chains are used, and I think it's great that we have a common understanding here that trade takes place very differently than 3, 4, even 2 decades ago. That now the importance of regional domestic markets linked to global markets, that these are important issues, and also that we have to measure and then analyze trade differently. I mean, I think this will still play an important role, but this question of this broader, more critical issues, I think they have to be included to really make the value chain approach, to use the potential of the value chain approach. And this is, I mean, power, governance, also a dynamic view on how countries are integrated, and that you can also change this or have to change this to different types of policies. And if there's still a policy space available for such actions, I mean, I think this has to be included to really use the potential of global value chains. And related to this is also the policy debate that comes out of using the global value chain approach. And because, as we also discussed yesterday in the keynote, I mean, I think it's really not interesting anymore to stick with this dichotomy between total protectionism or totally liberalized trade regimes. I mean, I think there are much more interesting and important questions we have to ask. We have to ask specifically for low-income countries. I mean, which policy space do they have? How can they use industrial policy, sector-specific, horizontally? What are the positive experiences? What are the challenges? Trade policy strategically probably has to play a role, also because the capabilities of some countries are limited. So trade policy can give room in certain aspects, like if you are a commodity exporter, certain strategic export taxes or certain local content rules. So I think that we really should focus on these interesting questions on how you conduct policy that ensure not only entry into value chains, but also like to gain from these value chains, global but also regional and domestic value chains. And I think there are still important policy questions we have to discuss, and I hope these panels now on industrial policy and trade policy will somehow focus our discussion a bit more on what does it mean for policy.